Hey, friends and listeners, this is Anne-Marie Zanzel, and you're listening to Coming Out and Beyond LGBTQIA Plus Stories podcast.
Welcome, everyone. I'm Barb Rowlandson, and Anne-Marie, we are now deep into season 4 of the Coming Out and Beyond podcast, and congratulations on what has turned out to be just a fantastic season so far.
And no thanks to you, Barb Rowlandson, my brand new producer, who is kicking ass in this podcast. So I want to thank Barb and all of our guests and listeners who make this podcast so special. If you're new to this podcast, let me fill you in a bit on what we do here at Coming Out and Beyond. This is a podcast devoted to sharing stories of real people, primarily women, trans, and non-binary folks who have made the brave step of coming out maybe early in life or maybe later in life.
And later in life, it's a subjective term. I mean, we have guests on the podcast that are in their 30s, 40s, 50s, and beyond. And they're from all walks of life, and they've discovered in their life's journey that they aren't quite as straight as they originally thought they were. And the lovely Anne-Marie here, our podcast founder and host, brings her signature compassion, wisdom, and insight as she interviews guests, creating a safe space for them to share their stories.
And Barb, our podcast producer and occasional co-host and guest, and maybe in the future a host, joins us regularly for the first time in season 4, adding fun, dimension, and a different perspective to topics surrounding the coming out later in life process.
So if you're someone who is later in life and early in the coming out process, here is where you are going to find inspiration and some great advice and a glimpse into the joy of what it means to come into your authentic sexuality.
So relax, kick your shoes off, grab a cup of coffee or tea, or maybe your favorite libation, put your headphones on, and join us for the next half hour or so to listen to another great, true story about coming out later in life and what lies beyond. I am so excited to welcome to the show today Leela Sinha. They are our gender. Use they, them pronouns.
I use either they, them, or ze, them, just like it says.
Okay. Yeah. Leela Sinha is a genderqueer, queer as fuck entrepreneur. Hey, we are the same person. Z is intense, spiritually grounded, real, funny, compassionate, and mostly interested in creating a better world with more pleasure and less pain. To that, and Z coaches and consults to uplift intense people. If you're told you're too much, that's you. And create leadership, companies, and systems where the bottom line is robust and everyone needs get met all the time, even yours. Leela, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here.
So Leela appeared on the screen and I saw the Rev in front of Z's name and I was like, oh my gosh. I'm a Reverend too. So I'm very excited to have Leela on the show today. And so Leela, tell me your story.
That's such a big question. Where would you like me to start?
Well, since this is about coming out and beyond, let's talk about that.
Okay. So the funny thing is that the longer I live, the earlier I start my coming out story. If you had asked me in 1995 when I came out, I would have said last year. However, since then, I've also come out as genderqueer, transmasculine. And because of that, I now rewind my story looking for the first moment when I knew that I wasn't really a girl. And so we're back to like somewhere between age 2 and 5.
Wow. But that often happens, right? When we come out, I find that people like start realizing, having recovered memory of, oh, wait a minute. So
and then I did that. And what often happens is it's in the communal storytelling spaces, which I think are regrettably harder to come by now than they were when I came out in the mid 90s. Partially because we're so deeply integrated into society in ways that we weren't, although we're certainly seeing some struggles around that these days.
Absolutely. So you were 2 to 5. Tell me about that.
Yeah. So as a 2-year-old, a 3-year-old, a 4-year-old, I was just very clear about who I was and what I wanted and how I wanted to be in the world. But my mom was a 1970s, like feminist, joined the League of Women Voters, you know, and so she inadvertently supported that. She dressed me in very gender neutral clothing. She maybe went a little further. Excuse me, that's my meditation bell to remind me to breathe. She dressed me in gender neutral clothing, and she didn't want me to have any representational toys at all. So no Barbies, no dolls. All I had was bristle blocks and Tinker toys and Legos before Legos came in kits. So it was just a bunch of bricks in the box, and you could build something. And her idea was that this would develop my imagination. I think she may regret having developed my imagination as well as she did, but here we are. So when I was 5, I have this memory of we're all lining up for, class, and they would line us up as one line of boys and one line of girls. And I would be standing there in line, chatting with the other kids in line and being like, yeah, there's not that much difference between boys and girls. We're really all the same.
Mm-hmm.
I'm 5.
How did your classmates respond to that?
I don't actually recall. I think they just thought I was weird. I also, my best friends at that time were boys. Mm-hmm. And it was probably, I don't know, another 2 years or so before I started to make friendships with girls, mm-hmm. mostly because girls and boys weren't talking to each other because there was this whole cooties thing. I don't know if kids still do that,
there was
but it was so weird.
There was a real, I think we look about the same age. So I think there was a real, if you grew up in the 70s, there was a real dividing line between what girl activities were and what boy activities were. And I completely understand that. I have a story, when I was in 5th grade, they showed the movie, which was about girls getting their periods. Mm-hmm. And I remember being like, when the boys asked what it was about, I was like, oh, they told us about that. And I got in such trouble with my female classmates because I sort of spilled the secret. And I'm like, who cares? Really, and I remember even at that time being like, this isn't a big deal. We don't have to have it this big mystery and stuff like that. So
you're not a mystery. I'm not a mystery. We can be not mysteries together. We can be curious together.
Yeah, absolutely. So, so it wasn't really until a couple of years later when you started to have friends with girls. And so what's the next part of that story?
I was always a little strange. I never fit into any of the boxes, and that was challenging, but it also really served me. So because I never fit in and I never met the social standard and I never interacted in the ways people expected me to, and I was interested in things that nobody else was interested in, I now suspect neurodivergence. But at the time, I didn't know that. And so it meant that when it came time to think about dating and sexuality and who I might be interested in romantically, I knew that I might eventually be interested in boys, perhaps, but I also felt absolutely no compunction about being like, not right now. Mm-hmm. That looks mm-hmm. like a whole lot of drama I don't need. Mm-hmm. So I actually deliberately chose not to even think about dating until I was almost done with high school.
Mm-hmm. So then
when I did think about it, I did start by dating boys, and I started by, but I was very I don't want to do this in public. I don't want to do this. I don't want this social judgment that comes with public dating. It's it's none of anybody's business. I'm an introvert. I'm shy. and I'm demi. Mm-hmm. And so I only formed close and romantic relationships with people I was friends with. And that was true pretty much. That's always been true.
Since you've come out, have you now looked back on that and see that the reason why you had such strong opinions about dating is because you were probably dating the wrong gender?
It was never the wrong gender.
Mm-hmm.
I'm queer. That's the word I claim.
Mm-hmm.
And I fall in love with people and not the packages they come in.
Mm-hmm. I understand.
And so it wasn't that I should not have been dating a particular gender. It was that I did not play any of the gender games the way they were written in the script. And so the only people that I dated pretty much consistently were people who also did not play by the script.
Pretty cool. Was it cool?
It was.
Yeah.
I mean, certainly I've had my share of relationship problems with all kinds of genders of people. But dating people was more about, hey, I really like you. I've known you for a couple of years or longer. And now I'm starting to have these romantic feelings or these sexual feelings. And how do we want to proceed together? And I learned that from having gone through AYS when I was in 8th grade. So stop, rewind. I was very active in the Unitarian Universalist Church. My mom was a Sunday school teacher. My father was on the Buildings and Grounds Committee. My mom was actually raised Unitarian, which is fairly rare in our denomination to have somebody who's multi-generationally Unitarian Universalist. Not impossible, but rarer. And especially rare to then have people of my generation have stayed. So I ended up getting into youth group and young adult leadership from AYS. So AYS is about your sexuality. It is the predecessor to our about your sexuality.
Okay, got it.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah.
So AYS is a curriculum. It's a religious education curriculum meant to be taught in Sunday school, although it can be taught in other places, called About Your Sexuality. Now, AYS has been superseded by a newer curriculum called Our Whole Lives. And Our Whole Lives is a lifespan sexuality education program that was jointly developed with the UCC. So I don't know if you're familiar with it, but
I'm not, no.
So when we went as a denomination, when we went to develop that curriculum, we kind of looked at what had worked and not worked with AYS. We decided that it would make sense to team up with another liberal religious organization, and the UCC was amenable. So what it is now is a series of, like, the center of the curriculum, which is the informational part, and then there's a religious supplement for each of our denominations so that we can add in our kind of religious values overlay.
So the AYS curriculum that you went in, can you tell me what year? Like
that was like 1988, 87, 88.
Okay. So you were a young adult then.
No, AYS was for 8th graders.
Okay. So you were 13, 14. So what did it teach you? You said you have a lot of you give it a lot of credit. So what did it teach you? I'm just really curious. And was there any talk about, non-straight relationships? Yeah.
So it was developed starting in the 1970s by a group of Unitarian Universalist ministers and assorted other experts. And it was an incredibly explicit, clear sexuality education curriculum, but it wasn't just plumbing, right? It wasn't just have A slot B. It was also how to communicate. What language do we use? How does that language affect how we think about our sexuality? How do we do this in groups? What is peer pressure and how does that impact us? Like, all of that conversation was built into this curriculum.
Wow. It sounds like a very powerful curriculum.
It was. And the only way I would have been satisfied is as it has happened, moving forward into an even more robust curriculum. Now we teach early elementary, late elementary, middle school, high school, and I think there are 2 levels of adult curriculum. Wow. So we really do lifespan, and we're in the process of overhauling it because, of course, it's out of date, because it's always out of date. But it gave me the skills to communicate with someone, to say, hey, what do you want? And hear what they wanted without judgment, to be able to say what I wanted and expect to be heard without judgment, to be able to say, hey, what are you into? And there was like a whole section on queerness, on gay, lesbian, bisexual. That was all the categories we had in the 80s, but talking about a little bit about trans identities. Again, there wasn't a lot available, but what we had, we had. And so I became the go-to person in my circle of friends and acquaintances. Like, even though there were a lot of people who weren't my friends, but they knew I had information about sex. And so they would come to me in high school and be like, I got a question. And I'd be like, I don't have the answer. Let me go ask the grown-ups at church. I'll get back to you.
So what's amazing to me, as you know, like all the Catholic Church does about sex is shame you. I mean, it's like shame, shame, shame. So a lot of the work I do with the later in life people that are, you know, come out from conservative religions, we have to unpack all the things that we've been taught as women. And
one of my partners was raised Catholic, so
you get it. You get it. Yeah. And before we can even get to the sexuality piece, and like, what a gift that was for you. Like I can't imagine, I say to myself, how would my life have been different if I had been taught that instead of being taught, you know, what I was taught. So that's really cool.
Yeah, it was a huge pivotal part of so I still thought of myself as an ally. But it never occurred to me not to think of myself as an ally, because nobody in my immediate world was telling me I shouldn't be. I wasn't really listening to my parents at that point. We weren't talking about it, but they were taking me to church. And this is what I was learning in church. And there were, you know, gay and lesbian people in church in leadership positions, kind of visibly everywhere. The Unitarians performed the first recorded ceremony of union that we know about in 1958. So we've been on this track for a minute, and, you know, the AIDS crisis was right there with us, and we were talking about it in church.
And most likely being advocates for queer people who were struggling with AIDS.
Yeah. And when we went on our coming of age trip to Boston, because we were in Connecticut, so it wasn't a long trip, and all of Unitarianism kind of centers its origin point in Boston. It's more complicated than that, but that's where headquarters is.
Yeah. Transcendentalists, right? Were they the formers of, like it's the Walden Pond guy.
Thoreau.
I'm sorry,
Emerson.
my American religious education is failing me right now, Leela. I'm sorry, but I know it's from there.
You're fine. Yeah, so it was Emerson and Thoreau and Ballou and all of those people. And so we had a practice of every year the 8th graders would go to Boston and kind of see all the historic sites, and the minister would take us. He really liked to like quote famous people at their grave or at the church where they used to preach or whatever. We went to see, you know, the Baltimore Unitarian Church, which I got to see it sometime later, was you know, the church where the Unitarian, like the sermon that started Unitarianism happened at the Baltimore church. So we would take field trips. But this one particular field trip, we were standing outside Arlington Street Church, which in Boston was like the epicenter of, it was known as the gay church. And outside there were people tabling, you know, kind of selling stuff on the street with pins and buttons and backpacks and patches and stuff. And I picked up a pin that said silence equals death. And I wore it on my backpack for the rest of my educational time, you know, from 8th grade all the way through college. And nobody batted an eyelash. Nobody thought that was weird.
So you go through college, and experimental time or no?
So I came out in my second year of college.
Okay. So can I ask you, since you identify as genderqueer now, what did you come out as? Because we didn't have a lot of the language that you're using right now. For people that don't know, like in 1992, there was no genderqueer. So what did you come out?
In 2006, there wasn't genderqueer.
Yeah. The language is it's sometimes the language in the queer community, especially around non-binary and trans folks, change so quickly. Sometimes it's hard to keep up unless you're directly into that community. So what did you come out in 1990?
At the time, I was still identifying as female, and I came out as bisexual.
Okay.
Those were the words that I had immediately. And I almost instantly picked up queer instead of bisexual, because I really didn't like the implied binary. I know that there's much more complex conversation about that now, but queer was really the word of currency at the time. I had just taken the first queer studies class, one of the two first queer studies classes offered by my college. I was at Carleton College, and we had a class called Amazons, Valkyries, Naiads, Dykes, lesbian literature from Sappho to the 1920s. And it was
Where'd
being
you go
taught
to school? I'm curious.
Carleton College.
Oh,
in
okay.
Northfield, Minnesota.
I know where that is. I have young kid friends that went there. So yeah.
And it was being taught avocationally by a Russian professor.
Wow.
And so she was super into film. She was super into this kind of historic 1920s lesbian culture exploration. She was rumored to be straight? Question mark. A lot of people had questions about that. I still don't have the answer to that one. And it was taught so in the same term as a dance class that was the other first queer. That's why I'm like, it's one of two first queer studies classes taught at school. So it was through that I kind of went, And then I started hanging out with somebody who was the campus dyke. And I think she would still probably say that about herself. And it was sitting with her and hearing her sort of opine on the various attractiveness of the various people that walked by in the student center or whatever. I was like, oh, I have opinions about that too. Oh, that's interesting. And coming out, the moment of coming out was literally like, yeah, I think I'm also into girls. Okay.
Well, that makes, yeah. And also too, you've had like such a life up to that point where it was okay. That was like, okay, whatever.
Yeah, I was like, I'm not telling my parents until it's important. But like anybody else I told, they were like, yeah.
That makes sense.
Please pass the salt.
Yeah. Can I ask you something? I have noticed that queer is like, I call myself queer as well. I really thought it was more of a like early 2000s word, the reclamation of that word. Do you think it was because you were in academia that the word was so prevalent there and you called yourself queer? Because like my wife, who came out in 1985, she's fine with the word now, but still sometimes it's hard for her. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I think language is generational. So another piece of background for me is that I now co-moderate a transmasculine Discord with about 1,700 members worldwide. It's me and like 8 or 9, maybe 12 other moderators. We have a big mod team, but we need one. And one of the things about that is that I have a constantly like active sample of about 200 to 300 people, their experiences, their opinions, their presence in queerness or not, because often people come into transmasculinity from straightness, and that is a wild ride. But we're in this place now where queer is like, a lot of people don't like queer. They're like unreclaiming it. Or they feel like it's not specific enough. We're in this moment of identity politics where specificity of identities are really important. In the people of color community, we often hear people saying, oh, I don't want to be lumped in with other people of color. I want my particular experience lifted out or specified. Black folks often don't want to be in a BIPOC conglomeration. They're like, no, my Black experience is specific. Indigenous people are like, my Indigenous experience is specific. And now in the API community, Asian Pacific Islander, we're like, Asian Pacific Islander, what kind of a weird conglomeration is that? Like,
right, absolutely. Like yeah, I get that. I mean, you guys, people are from such different places and your experiences are all different.
Right. And we experience marginalization very differently. So we want to specify, like, this is my experience, this is your experience. But as we know from organizing from, generations back, sometimes having a collective identity is also useful. We're specific and we're collective. And I came of age in the moment of queer history when a queer collective identity was extremely important because of the AIDS epidemic, because we were coming into this moment where it wasn't just gay men, it was everybody. And it had to not just be gay men anymore because they were all dying. The generation directly above me was basically dead.
Absolutely. They were.
Years later, I had the opportunity to do a funeral for someone who had survived, who had gotten AIDS and survived for years and years and years after most of his peers had died. And oh my God, like, because that moment in history was so formative.
I had a son when I was working as a hospice chaplain. I had a son of a patient, and he was actually, he was probably 2012, 13, and he was a survivor. He never got AIDS, but it was his generation. He was a professor at a college, and listening to his stories was so unbelievably profound, and how many people that he saw die as a young man. On my first, if you want to hear, I'm just saying this to the listeners. In the first season, the last episode with Judy, she's a lesbian that was living in San Francisco at the time, and she did a lot of work with the men that passed, and her story is amazing. So we had to unify because, that generation is dying. And, I think it had such a profound effect on the LGBTQ community, also in the sense of what happened afterwards, in the sense of visibility and changing things for a lot of us. So you come out and act, you came out and like, hey, yeah, I'm bisexual. Yeah. I
called my fiance at the time and I was like, hey, I think I'm bisexual. And he was like, yeah, I was wondering when you were going to figure that out.
So what happened next?
I was just, living life, queer, doing my thing. I presented as, it gave me space to lean into presenting a little more masculine. But I never took on like the full on butch identity because I didn't feel like I fit the stereotypes well enough to do that. So coming out, finding my identity and then being like, yeah, don't fit here either. Very, very, I live my life in the liminal spaces, and that was
so. It sounds like a lot of people, but I think that's sort of typical because there are people that I have worked with people that come out and it's about, like, at first they think it's about sexual orientation, but then as time goes on, they were like, oh, this is more about gender for me. I've had several people that have come out as transmasculine after, starting in a late in life lesbian group. So I think now with the next generations, or the generations that are maybe young millennials or Gen Zs, there is talk about gender so much more. But I think for our generation, or you're actually younger than me, but for your generation and the generation before you, it was more about sexual orientation. Like there was just the LGBT at that point. So I think that's super cool. Yeah,
when I came out, it was LGB.
Yeah, no T. No T. Though there was plenty of T people around, but
it was there, but it wasn't in the list. It wasn't in the public consciousness. It wasn't in the discourse yet.
So you started to realize that, wait a minute, maybe it's more than sexual orientation.
I didn't really think about it beyond, I got really into reading about gender presentation within the queer women's community. So I lived in Minneapolis for a little over a year. And so I had access to the original Amazon books, the Amazon Feminist Co-op bookstore.
Oh, wow. That's funny.
And, there was this moment where, this is like a classic coming out moment, where I decided I wanted to cut my hair. I had always had hair like down past my waist because, in part because of my Indian heritage, that was a very like normal thing for me to have. And then at some point I was like, you know what, I've been talking about cutting my hair for a few years. I'm coming up, I'm getting ready to go to seminary. I just want to try this. So I had already interviewed at seminary, but I hadn't gone yet. And in that winter between interviewing and actually going down to Chicago, I got someone to cut my hair for me, and I buzzed it to half an inch long. And it was transformative because it was the first time I looked in the mirror and recognized myself. And then I went back to the Amazon Feminist Co-op bookstore where I had been shopping for months. and I got treated totally differently, and it broke my heart.
How so? Can you say more?
When I went in there with my long braid, even if I was buying, like queer erotic writing or, sexual assault recovery material, like the kinds of things that you buy from a feminist co-op store, I got like perfectly reasonable customer service. I didn't notice anything was wrong. They would I would take my books up to the register. They'd say, how would you like to pay? I would give them my card or my cash, and they would check me out because this was the 90s. So, I guess this was the early 2000s. So, cash was still a thing. And I would leave the store with my purchases, and I thought that was normal. I went in with my cut hair, and suddenly I got eye contact. I got conversation. I'm very bad at telling whether I'm being flirted with, but it might have been happening. I got so much more engagement and conversation.
I actually thought you were going to tell me something different, but that is pretty amazing. So all of a sudden you were being seen as a queer woman.
Yeah. All of a sudden I was recognizable.
Yes.
I don't know why buying queer erotica in a queer bookstore was not recognizable behavior. I mean, I do, right? Because people have stereotypes and people make up stories about people.
Yes, right. And also too,
I wasn't going in there with a clergy collar on. I wasn't ordained yet.
Yeah, but women love butch presenting women.
That's also a thing.
Yeah, but that's my attraction. My wife is a masculine of center. I love butch I love them. I think they're so freaking beautiful. And so I think that, I'm wondering if that's what happened, is there was like a lot of women in there that were feminists and possibly lesbian. And all of a sudden this butch, you looked more butch. And so they're like, oh.
But it's funny because the only thing that changed was my hair. It was particularly impactful because at the very same moment when I would go into like a rest stop bathroom or an airport bathroom or public washroom and bump into someone who is South Asian, they no longer recognized me. They wanted to like scoot their kids away from me. They didn't recognize me as South Asian anymore. When I had a long braid, they all recognized me as South Asian and would be like, say hello to the nice auntie. And so I lost a community and gained a community. And I knew that was going to happen. Like I was absolutely aware of what I was doing. And I was like, well, I just want to cut my hair, and I'm not going to let, that public identity affect whether I can cut my hair or not. I'm not doing that.
In the same vein, I came out late. I came out at 50. I lived a straight life with a husband and kids.
Wow, that's a journey.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. You should read my stuff. And so I was 52 when I came out. I was married 27 years to my now ex-husband. I've been with my wife 7 years now. We got married a couple of years ago. And how I get treated is, and I'm in the South now versus being in Connecticut. We're both from Connecticut. How I get treated, there is noticeable difference. We go to Chico's and because I'm of that age and I like their clothes and they're comfortable.
Sure.
but also too, like I noticed and they see me with my wife. They're polite, but they make no effort to connect with me the way they did when I was, just a straight presenting woman. I talked about my daughter was getting married, so that I was trying to make conversation, and polite, but I could feel so my wife, who has been out for a gazillion million years, doesn't see that.
Right. We don't notice it because we never had it.
Right. But I notice it. And I think it's a superpower because there is the privilege of living as a straight person. And if you've never lived as a straight person, you just think it's normal. So that's what I thought you were going to talk about. But it's really interesting how we present and how we perceive really, really does change how people treat us. And
It
it's pretty like it's amazing because you still feel like the same person inside in a lot of ways, but it is really amazing how people like treat us based on how our hair is or who our partner is that we're walking into with.
What was striking to me is that I had never been treated as an insider because I'm brown, because like I said, I never really fit the social molds. So I went from not having any place where I was an insider to having a place where I was an insider. Mm-hmm. Because even in Indian communities, first of all, if you're queer and South Asian, that's a whole complicated situation. Although there are a few people, when I was traveling in India, I was in India for 8 months when I was 24. And there's a singer named Falguni Pathak who I took one look and I'm like, she's got to be queer. Mm-hmm. But she wasn't out. And mm-hmm. I wasn't about to like even ask my relatives mm-hmm. if they thought, maybe, because that wasn't a conversation they were having in 2001 in India. Mm-hmm. She's out now. Mm-hmm. I saw an article the other day. Mm-hmm. So there's this like noticing, finding those queer folk moments, but not actually being inside the South Asian community, not actually being inside any group of women ever. Like so I smell funny to women, like not literally, but like there's this thing where I don't play girl well, and I never did. Mm-hmm. And I think probably your wife has the same experience. Mm-hmm. Do you use the word mm-hmm. wife? Does she use the word wife?
Yeah, she loves the word wife because she was so excited to be able to get married. So wife. She says wife when you don't even need to say it.
So I think probably your wife may have a similar experience of like mm-hmm. just when your gender is masculine of center, whether you identify as girl or woman or not, you don't play the same way. You don't follow the same script. And then you grow up and you're like, well, I still don't follow the same script. So here we are.
I'm not sure with Tanda, her name is Tanda, because she also grew up Southern. She's a Southern girl. She's a Southern woman.
I would never have survived the South.
Yeah. And so she did everything. Like she, it wasn't really until she got into the lesbian community that she really started to present more, more masculine of center and stuff like that. But there's a whole different animal when you've grown up in the South. And now having lived in the South and worked with a lot of Southern women, there's layers that you and I from New England don't have.
I have Southern friends and they're like, why don't you come to the South? And I'm like, because I am a Yankee and I'm always going to be a Yankee. And there is no way that I could possibly navigate those layers of social strata.
High five, girl. I'm sorry.
And it's high five. No shade. I know that the South is a rich and beautiful place.
Yes, it is.
A lot to offer. I would die. I would literally die, but I would also metaphorically die.
Well, it's really interesting. And we're getting off topic here, but I love talking about this. What is really interesting is watching how my wife is treated in the South as a masculine of sin. Like they literally don't even know she exists. They don't look at her. They don't talk to her. Mm-hmm. And she's quite used to that. So she doesn't care anymore, but it's really, really interesting watching that. And because I'm more femme presenting, a lot of times people just don't assume I'm straight, right? Until she shows up. Right. And then they know, oh, she isn't. And it's been a very interesting experience being in the South, but she still has a lot of those Southern tendencies. Like she just does. It was in her mother was a Southern woman.
I mean, you learn whatever culture you grow up in.
Absolutely.
I grew up in the suburbs of New York City. I am in my bones. I have New York City culture, even though I didn't grow up in New York proper. But that whole like, well, that person may be weird, but they are weird.
Yes.
Like I'm going to mess with them, but nobody else gets to mess with them. Like that thing feels very at home to me.
But I do want to say as a late in life lesbian, coming South was really good because there's so many women in the South that come out later.
Mm-hmm.
And I have found my Southern lesbians that my wife, her group of friends, I'm the only, except for one other person, I'm the only one that has children or who've ever been married to the man. A lot of them are what we call gold star
lesbians.
Yeah, which I hate.
I have opinions.
Yeah. But let's not go there. But they don't claim that. I'm just describing them. And they have been nothing but loving and welcoming and kind to me. So I have, with the women I've worked with a lot of times, when they are on the coast and they come out later in life, it's sometimes hard to break into the community. And they oftentimes find that because a lot of the people that especially in the cities of Portland, Seattle, San Francisco, going down the coast and the East Coast as well, the gays flee to the cities. So a lot of times the people that are out have been out for a really, really long time. And so a lot of times there's a lot of resistance to the people that are newer to the community, that have been married and stuff like that. I find that people who are in the South are much more oh, come on, join us. You want to join us? Well, we need people.
I've lived in urban and very rural areas. I've lived in towns that were less than 1,000 people. And I've lived in cities like Chicago, Ottawa, San Francisco, Berkeley. And my experience is that the more variety and numbers we have, the pickier we are about who we hang. So if you live in a town of 1,000 people, all the queers are talking to each other. You know why? Because there are 10. Which is like it was in Minneapolis when I lived in Minneapolis in 2001, 2002. There were, the queer women's community was small enough that we kind of all knew each other. We were still in that situation where you stay friends with your exes because they're going to be at the next potluck. And they probably slept with your best friend before you, and they're probably going to sleep with your other best friend after you. So you're just going to have to figure this out.
Leela, I got to introduce you to my wife. She goes, there was one mimeograph sheet. And
exactly.
If you do make it to the lesbian dance, she says the exact same thing. She once went to a dance and 4 of her exes were all sitting at the same table.
Yeah, if you dated a lot, you dated everybody in town.
Yeah, absolutely.
And you could not do the thing that we do now in the queer community a little bit, and straight people have apparently been doing forever, which is avoiding your exes. You couldn't do it. And now we can do it. And my joke about living...
If you're in a big city.
Right. And my joke about living we can also do that on the internet, because we have the internet, which is the biggest city. But my joke about living in the Bay Area is that the queer bears who like to fuck on Tuesdays have their own club, and that's it's so specific, and it's so getting into those groups is a lot harder. People have been burned. If you've been out for longer, you've had more opportunities to be burned for being queer. With somebody who's I think I want to experiment.
Absolutely.
I don't want to be your experiment. Go figure out your identity and then come back and talk to me later. You're cute, but no.
Well, it's so actually talking to you, Leela, is so affirming for me, because all those things you've said, I've written articles and stuff like that, because the thing is that a lot of women that identify as lesbian early or not straight, they're scared because they have been with a woman that's questioning her sexuality, and they've gotten deeply, deeply hurt.
Right. They've then been dumped so the woman can go back to her nice, safe, straight looking relationship because being queer was too hard.
Yes, absolutely.
And there are so many layers of betrayal built into that experience. But most people who go through it once or twice, unless they really have a thing for newbies, most people who go through it once or twice are done. They're done. They're like, listen, unless you've at least had dated 3 women before me, I'm not interested.
Well, and that's really interesting, because my wife never dated someone coming out in the closet before. But I also was somebody who wasn't going back. Once I was out, and that didn't even enter into anything. But the thing is I was a mess. And she wrote an article once called when this old time lesbian dated a newbie.
Yeah.
Both of us, like even myself, who work with people coming out later in life, I would hesitate if something happened to my wife. I would date someone just coming out, because there's just so much you have to go through, and you know, a lot of times people coming out often date other people just coming out, which has its pluses and its minuses. Yeah, because I always say I got the crash course in being a lesbian because my wife had been out. And so every time some sort of internalized homophobia would come up, she would challenge me. So, I mean, she gave me that crash course. And so I think that really, really like pushed me along so much farther, so much faster.
And often when you do that with somebody, what happens next is they reject you because you've been too painful to be around for too long. Like they're like, this hurts.
Yeah. And
so you have to have the right person on both sides of that equation, and you have to have the right relationship chemistry, and you have to have at least some sense of secure attachment in each person, because if you have, you know, anxious and avoidant attachment styles running around in the middle of all that, like it almost never goes well. Almost never.
Well, I absolutely agree with you. I understand what you're saying totally. And what I want to say is that we've worked really, really, really hard. And in fact, we just had a little argument today, and we apologized and stuff. And I said, damn, awareness is freaking hard. It
is. And it doesn't get easier.
Because I'm like, oh God, I was such an ass. Okay, we are so off topic here. I love talking to you.
I feel like I should apologize, but I'm also not sorry.
I know. I'm like, oh. So you went to seminary. What? Like, let's talk about that.
I went to Unitarian Universalist Seminary.
And you wanted to be a minister. Was it right after college, or did you work for a couple of years?
I had 5 years between college and seminary. I really wanted to think about it. I had dated someone in seminary when he was in seminary, and I had been with him long enough to know what the process was like and to know how brutal it was. And I was like, I'm never doing that. And then the call came, and you know what that's like. You can shut the door. You can try barring the door. You're just going to have a house with a broken down door because it is coming.
Yeah.
So when I decided to go to seminary, I wasn't worried particularly about my identity being a problem. I was actually much more concerned that my polyamory would be a problem. And that was some ice breaking that I did to like show up at a seminary event with 2 partners, and not the same 2 partners I have now, but that's another story. And to just get people used to the idea, you know, I think it probably served all of us really well in the end to
absolutely
just have that experience.
I've met other people who are in seminary and the polyamorous, that really, man, those the committees on ministry, that really, like, especially people who are straight, like so flummoxed by all of that.
I went before the committee on ministry, which is in our denomination, that's like the last gatekeeping to become a minister. And I was prepared to say, listen, y'all sent me to AYS when I was in 8th grade, and I learned that consenting adults doing consenting adult things is okay, and here we are. But I never had to say that.
Oh, wow.
And now
I'm so glad.
We're so far. They just didn't ask about it. They asked about everything else. I think they knew they didn't want to get into that mess. And
I don't know, maybe they would have gotten into some weeds, but they didn't. I think they chose that it wasn't important to you as a minister.
Right. And I still have definitely run into obstacles with regard to all of the pieces of my identity. I didn't actually start claiming trans until a few years ago, because when I started being really clear that I was genderqueer, it was like 2004. And we didn't, and I was in seminary, but we didn't have an established space for people who are in between. right? We had an established space, and in between is not even, I don't even think of gender as a linear spectrum anymore. So that's not even really the right word. But at the time, that's what I wanted. I wanted a word for in between, and we didn't have it. We had genderqueer, which felt good and right and fit in with all the other identity pieces of queerness, but we didn't have language for talking about, I don't want to transition to being a man. I'm not a man and I'm not a woman.
Mm-hmm.
I'm this other, secret third thing. And how do I name that? And even now I still struggle with, how do I present that to the world? Like, how do I dress in a way that will convey my gender, because gender is so important to the people around me.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But coming through like seminary and graduation and going into the parish and then being in the parish for 4 years and then coming out of the parish, there were so many instances where what I encountered was well-meaning people who didn't know how to enact their good intentions.
You've been listening to Coming Out and Beyond, LGBTQIA plus stories with Anne-Marie Zanzel. New episodes of the Coming Out and Beyond podcast drop every other Friday. You can tune in at Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, and at annemariezanzel.com. Be sure to hit subscribe when tuning in so you never miss an episode. And for more resources, articles, videos, and a free downloadable guide for coming out later in life, visit annemariezanzel.com.